Hello, you're watching BBC World News. I'm Naga Munchetti. Our top story: Australia says that 2 objects have been spotted in the Indian Ocean which may be linked to the missing Malaysia Airlines plane. Australia's Prime Minister has described the information as new and credible.
The Australian Maritime Safety Authority has received information based on satellite imagery of objects possibly related to the search.
Welcome to the programme. Other stories we're keeping across for you. Diplomatic efforts continue over Russia's annexation of Crimea while the EU considers more sanctions against Moscow. And a prehistoric flappy bird, the discovery that has paleontologists crowing over a new species of dinosaur.
Hello, I'm Sally Bundock. In business, EU leaders meet up for a 2-day summit, and top of the agenda is a credible response to Russia without a cost to member states. And Toyota's recent $1.2 billion settlement may be a model for a US probe into General Motors allegedly concealing ignition problems.
Welcome. The hunt for the missing Malaysian Airlines plane has yielded fresh clues. Australia says 2 objects that may be related to flight MH370 have been identified on satellite imagery in the Indian Ocean. Military aircraft are on their way to the area to try to locate the objects, and all of this comes as the BBC has learned that the satellite transmissions detected from the missing plane could only have come from a moving aircraft. So there are 2 air corridors which have been searched. There are now strong suggestions that the jet's flight computer was reprogrammed, redirecting it over the vast expanses of the southern Indian Ocean. The focus now is very much on the corridor which passes to the west of Australia. Now, the objects were spotted 2,500 kilometres southwest of Perth. John Young is from the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, and he described what the satellites had seen.
The objects are relatively indistinct on the imagery. I don't profess to be an expert in assessing the imagery, but those who are expert indicate they are credible sightings. The indication to me is of objects that are a reasonable size and probably awash with water bobbing up and down out of the surface.
Can you give us any idea of the size? Like the size of a basketball or a seat cushion, or much larger than that?
No, much larger than that. The largest image that I've seen is assessed as being 24 metres. There's another one that's smaller than that, and a number of other images in the general area of the biggest one.
The latest developments came to light about 3 hours ago when the Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott told Parliament that they had this new information.
The Australian Maritime Safety Authority has received information based on satellite imagery of objects possibly related to the search. Following specialist analysis of this satellite imagery, 2 possible objects related to the search have been identified. I can inform the House that a Royal Australian Air Force Orion has been diverted to attempt to locate the objects. This Orion is expected to arrive in the area at about this time. 3 more aircraft will follow this Orion. They are tasked for more intensive follow-up search.
The Malaysian authorities have been reacting. This is the Transport Minister.
And I'm meeting the Australian delegation now. As I have been doing from day one, we have been following every single lead. And this time, I just hope that it is a positive.
OK, let's talk to Jonah Fisher in Kuala Lumpur. Jonah, shall we get to the Malaysian reaction in a moment? And let's just quickly find out what more you've heard from where you are.
Yeah, the most interesting briefing came from the Australian Maritime Authority. They gave a little bit more detail about what's been seen on these commercial satellite images. Now, the area is about 2,500 kilometres southwest of the Australian mainland, just off the area which we've talked about for several days now, a corridor, a southern corridor, which has been explored based on satellite data. Now, what did they say about those pieces? Well, they made it clear that it was indistinct. They couldn't really be very specific. One of those pieces is 24 meters in size, they said, by looking at the pieces. That could conceivably be a part of this aircraft, and that's why they're now flying a number of planes to the area to try and take a closer look, to try and get some more images, and also, if they can locate it, to drop a locator buoy there, so that then a ship can go in and actually have the close look, which they will need to have at this debris, and perhaps ascertain once and for all whether it is indeed part of MH370.
Jonah, on many pages of the international newspapers are pictures of distressed family members. They are frustrated that they haven't been told enough, that the information they've received has been inconsistent, and a lot of this criticism is going back to the Malaysian authorities, and we heard from the Transport Minister there saying he wanted to verify things before taking it any further, but they are under a lot of pressure, aren't they?
They're under a lot of pressure. They've been under pressure for the last 13 days to demonstrate that they were making progress in the search for this aircraft. They've always stressed that it was an unprecedented situation. I think many people do have some sympathy for that argument. There was really very little trace of this aircraft once it disappeared off its what was going to be its flight route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. I think what we've seen today, though, is something which has very much been driven from the Australian part of the operation. They were given information from the American part of the investigating team about possible flight paths. They managed to narrow it down based on what they know about how much fuel the aircraft might have had. And then they've been surveying that area with American, Australian and also New Zealand surveillance aircraft. Now, the location of this debris is just south of that area. But of course it's 13 days on and there are lots of currents and winds, so it is conceivable that whatever happened there, the debris from a possible crash might have drifted.
Jonah, we're going to speak very soon, I'm sure. I know you're keeping across all the breaking news that's coming through and developments. For the moment, I'll say thank you. Jonah Fisher there, our man in Kuala Lumpur. Let's get to Sally, who's here in the studio, preparing for World Business Report and taking quite a close look at a meeting in Brussels today. Yes, the EU leaders are gathering in Brussels for their spring summit. Now, of course, the agenda's completely changed. What's top of the agenda is the discussion about sanctions against Russia. On Monday, if we have a recap of what's happened so far this week, the US ordered the freezing of assets and travel bans on 11 individuals, while the EU imposed such sanctions on 21 people. Now, the EU's potential sanctions list is thought to include more than 100, including rich business, Russian business, men and women with significant interests in the EU and US. But the potential for broader US sanctions on Russia and Moscow's threat of responding in kind are raising concerns among US corporations and investors about the economic fallout. So we'll be discussing all of this with a professor, economics professor, based in Moscow. Also as well, after the Japanese car giant Toyota agreed to pay $1.2 billion to settle a criminal dispute with the United States over the safety of its vehicles, now it could begin all over again, this time with General Motors. GM has now recalled 1.6 million cars, but the US Justice Department's launched an investigation into whether the company reported the recall in a fair and legal way. The company has admitted knowing about an ignition switch problem for more than a decade, and some individuals who've had their cars recalled are now starting to file lawsuits against the company. So we're looking at that story, plus, of course, market reaction in Asia today to the news coming from the US Federal Reserve late yesterday. All that and more in about 20 minutes. See you then. See you then, Sally. Thank you. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon is to hold talks with President Putin in Moscow later. This is a fresh effort to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis over Russia's annexation of Crimea. As Sally was mentioning, European leaders are meeting in Brussels. They're going to discuss calls for tougher sanctions against Russia. Tensions in Crimea remain high, of course, after pro-Russia forces seized 2 naval bases, including Ukraine's Navy headquarters. Our correspondent Richard Galpin is in Moscow for us. Richard, Sally was looking at the economic implications of the meeting, and we were discussing earlier about sanctions and really how effective they've been, and so far President Putin doesn't seem to be that bothered.
No, certainly so far. I think that's absolutely right. They've not taken the sanctions which have been imposed at all seriously. I mean, it's been almost like a derisive, dismissive response by the individuals who've been affected by the sanctions so far. You know, it's a very small group of people, 32, 33 people, some pretty senior ones, but they were all saying, well, actually, we don't have any assets in the United States or the European Union, so it doesn't affect us. That's what they're saying. Whether that's true, of course, is difficult to know. So, but I think, you know, the absolutely key question now is how far the European Union and US will ramp up these sanctions, you know, because there is concern here that if the sanctions become broader, start targeting the Russian economy more broadly, then that could have a very serious effect. The economy here is particularly weak at the moment. And I think also if they do go after individuals who have got assets in the European Union, in the United States, who need to travel there frequently, and if those individuals are close to Vladimir Putin, I think that also will have an impact. If those people are hurting, then potentially it'll make people think about the consequences of Russian action. Having said that all, though, I'm sure the Kremlin has thought this through before it decided to move in the way it did on Crimea.
Tell us, Richard, while all this is going on, is Mr. Putin, President Putin, still as popular, and is his popularity still increasing, as we've spoken about in recent days?
Well, I haven't seen any more recent opinion polls, but certainly the initial opinion polls taken during this crisis have shown that Mr. Putin's popularity has increased. So he is definitely riding a high. And I think, you know, what we need to look at now is what Moscow and specifically the Kremlin's approach is going to be going forward now. It still has its troops massed along Ukraine's eastern border. Are they going to stay there? Is there going to be any further military intervention? Or will the Kremlin now decide, you know, we've managed to achieve a very significant thing as far as we're concerned. Do we leave it at that, but maintain pressure on Ukraine to change its direction, to become more compliant to Moscow's wishes without further military intervention?
There's a lot of uncertainty, but one thing I know for sure, we are going to be speaking again about this and the developments very soon, no doubt. Richard, always good to see you. Richard Galpin in Moscow there. Thanks. Stay